Behind the walls of a perfect Christian home, a father's secret double life turned into an unimaginable nightmare. What began as love and faith ended in betrayal and murder. This is the chilling story of Chris Coleman, the man who destroyed his family to protect his image. It began like the kind of story that made people question everything they thought they knew about trust, faith, and family. In the quiet town of Columbia, Illinois, nestled just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, stood a comfortable suburban home where a family of 4 seemed to live the ideal Christian life. To friends, neighbors, and colleagues, Chris and Sherry Coleman embodied stability and faithfulness. 2 people deeply connected through their religion, their children, and their devotion to one another. But beneath that calm surface, something dark was beginning to stir, something that would soon shatter that image forever. Chris Coleman was a man of discipline, a former Marine who had transformed his military experience into a respected career as the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, a multimillion-dollar Christian empire followed by millions worldwide. His position wasn't just a job, it was a symbol of trust. He was responsible for protecting one of the most famous televangelists in America, a woman who spoke of grace, morality, and truth. Chris wore that responsibility proudly. He dressed neatly, kept his body fit, and spoke with quiet confidence. He was the type of man people looked up to, especially within the tight-knit community of believers. Sherry Coleman was the heart of the family. Warm, social, and full of life, she balanced her husband's stern demeanor with a gentle and nurturing nature. She doted on their 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin, and filled their home with laughter and color. The boys were her pride. Garrett, 11 years old, loved sports and video games, while 9-year-old Gavin was playful and full of curiosity. Together, the family attended church, posed for holiday photos, and often appeared in public as a portrait of happiness. But in private, Sherry could feel something slipping away. The man she had once loved, the man who once couldn't stand to be apart from her, had grown cold. It started with silence at dinner, unanswered calls, and nights where Chris came home late, explaining that his job required more travel and long hours. Sherry's instincts told her that something wasn't right. Her husband's smiles no longer reached his eyes. His compliments had turned into criticisms, and affection had turned into distance. There was no argument or dramatic confrontation, just an emptiness that grew wider with each passing day. What Sherry didn't know was that her husband's emotional detachment had a name: Tara Lintz. Tara wasn't a stranger. She had once been a close friend, someone from Sherry's high school years. Chris and Tara had reconnected online, and what began as casual conversation turned into flirtation, and then into an affair. Tara lived in Florida, hundreds of miles away, but their connection grew stronger through phone calls, texts, and secret visits. Chris promised Tara that soon, everything would change, that he would leave his wife and children and start a new life with her. But there was a problem. Chris's world revolved around an image. He worked for a Christian organization that valued family, morality, and faithfulness. A divorce would not only ruin his reputation but could cost him his job. To him, that was unthinkable. By late 2008, the double life he was living began to crack. Sherry was growing suspicious. She had seen messages on his phone that didn't feel right. His coldness had become unbearable, and friends noticed she looked anxious and withdrawn. At the same time, Chris began creating a bizarre plan to divert attention away from his crumbling marriage. He started sending threatening emails to himself. The messages were sinister, claiming that someone was targeting him because of his connection to Joyce Meyer. The unknown sender warned that if Chris didn't quit his job, his family would pay the price. Chris reported the threats to both local police and his employer, saying he feared for his family's safety. To everyone else, it appeared he was being stalked by a dangerous person, perhaps someone angry at Joyce Meyer or her ministry. But what no one knew was that the threats were coming from Chris's own laptop. It was an illusion he crafted carefully, hoping to build a narrative that would later explain away what he was planning to do. As winter turned to spring in 2009, the tension inside the Coleman home grew unbearable. Sherry confided in a close friend that she believed Chris was cheating. She said she wanted to fix the marriage for the sake of their children, But deep down, she feared it was too late. Meanwhile, Chris was living two realities. With his family, he was distant and irritable, often traveling for work. With Tara, he was affectionate and promising a future filled with love, marriage, and a fresh start. He told her he'd be free soon. She just needed to wait. By the end of April, Chris had begun preparing for the final act of his deception. He meticulously planned his wife and children's murders, intending to stage it as the work of the same mysterious person who had been sending threats. It was a plan that combined cold calculation with terrifying cruelty. On the evening of May 4, 2009, the Coleman family appeared to settle into an ordinary night. The boys got ready for school the next morning. Sherry texted friends goodnight, and Chris, as usual, prepared to leave early for his morning workout before work. But that night, while his family slept peacefully in their beds, he made his move. In the darkness of their home, Chris silently approached his wife and sons. No one screamed. No one fought back. They had no chance. Using his bare hands, he strangled Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin one by one. The method was intimate and brutal, leaving behind signs of struggle and horror that only investigators would later piece together. Then, as part of his staged crime scene, Chris took red spray paint and scrawled words on the walls, phrases like, "punished and you have paid," to make it appear that a deranged intruder, perhaps the same person from the threatening emails, had broken in and carried out the attack. Before leaving the house, he cleaned up, changed clothes, and drove to the gym as if nothing had happened. At 6:43 a.m., he called his neighbor, saying he couldn't reach his wife and asking police to check on her. It was the first step in a performance he hoped would convince everyone that he was the victim, not the monster. When officers arrived, the door was locked, and there was no response. They forced entry, and what they found inside was the kind of scene that would stay with them forever. The spray-painted walls, the lifeless bodies, the quiet home that had turned into a tomb. The perfect family was gone, destroyed from within. And the man who had vowed to protect them was the very one who had taken their lives. Outside, Chris stood with his phone, pretending to be worried, playing the role of a helpless husband waiting for answers. But the cracks in his story were already beginning to show. His emotionless tone, his timeline, his lack of genuine shock. All of it raised quiet suspicion. What began as a tragic discovery that morning would soon unravel into one of the most cold-blooded betrayals in recent American history. The story of the Coleman family had turned from faith and love to horror and deceit, and it was only the beginning. As dawn settled over Columbia, Illinois, on May 5, 2009, what began as a routine welfare check quickly spiraled into a homicide investigation that would grip the nation. The quiet neighborhood on Moving Water Drive was soon swarmed by police cars, detectives, and crime scene technicians. Word spread fast, the Coleman family was dead. Inside the home, investigators were confronted with a chilling scene. 3 bodies, all showing signs of strangulation, and angry red graffiti scrawled across the walls. Words like "punished" and "you have paid" screamed from the surfaces, painted hastily in thick strokes. To the untrained eye, it looked like the work of an obsessed stalker or religious extremist. But for the officers who had walked into hundreds of crime scenes before, something about it felt off. Detectives began examining every inch of the house. Sherry was found on the bed, face turned slightly to the side, as though she'd been caught by surprise. The boys were discovered in their bedrooms, their small bodies lying in positions that made seasoned investigators pause in silence. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no smashed locks, no indication that an intruder had ever set foot inside. Whoever did this had been welcomed in or already lived there. Meanwhile, outside the house, Chris Coleman stood at a distance, his arms crossed, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He appeared calm, too calm. Detectives noticed his lack of emotion, the absence of tears or visible shock. When he was told that his wife and children were gone, his reaction was muted. He didn't ask how they died, didn't collapse or scream. He simply stared, nodded, and whispered that he wanted to know who could have done such a thing. To trained investigators, it was the first of many red flags. Detectives quickly began piecing together the timeline. Chris claimed he had left the house around 5:43 a.m. to go to the gym. He said he tried calling Sherry when she didn't answer his morning texts and became worried when she didn't pick up. But the police knew time was everything in a case like this. They pulled surveillance footage from traffic and security cameras along his route, footage that would later become critical. Inside the Coleman home, evidence was mounting against the image of an outside threat. The spray paint found near the scene matched a can found in the garage. The handwriting looked awkward, almost staged, as if someone had tried too hard to mimic rage. And then there were the emails, the supposed death threats that Chris had been receiving for months. They became a central focus of the investigation. The messages had been sent from an anonymous Gmail account, warning Chris to quit his job with Joyce Meyer Ministries or suffer deadly consequences. The FBI cyber team was brought in to trace the source. What they uncovered would turn the case on its head. The emails were sent from Chris Coleman's own laptop, using his home's IP address. There was no mysterious stalker, there was only Chris. Detectives confronted him with this information, but he denied everything. He said maybe someone had hacked him, maybe someone was trying to set him up. But the lies started crumbling fast. Digital forensic experts found deleted files, drafts, and login data proving he'd written the threats himself. It was all part of an elaborate cover story meant to frame an imaginary killer, one that would explain away what he planned to do to his family. As investigators dug deeper, another name kept surfacing: Tara Lintz. She was a Florida woman, a friend of Sherry's from high school, and Chris's secret lover. Detectives discovered dozens of text messages and photos exchanged between them. They found travel records, phone logs, and emails. He'd sent her gifts and photos from his ministry trips. Their conversations were intimate, romantic, and filled with promises of a future together. Chris had told her he'd be free soon, that his marriage was ending, and that they could finally start their new life. When police contacted Tara, she admitted she and Chris were in a relationship. She was devastated to learn what had happened, but told investigators that Chris had insisted his marriage was over. She had no idea he'd been planning something so horrific. But her cooperation provided key evidence: phone records showing late-night calls, intimate photos, and messages that made it clear Chris was deeply involved with her right up until the murders. Meanwhile, Joyce Meyer and her ministry were drawn into the spotlight. Reporters flooded her offices, asking how a man so close to her, a man trusted with her safety, could commit such an atrocity. She revealed that Chris had indeed mentioned receiving threats and that she had urged him to contact the police. But she also said that around that time, she'd been made aware of his marital issues. It was a devastating revelation for a woman who preached about family and forgiveness, to learn that one of her most trusted employees had used her ministry as a backdrop for his deceit. Forensic analysis of the Coleman home painted an even darker picture. There were no signs of a struggle from Chris. His DNA was found throughout the house in ways that didn't match his version of events. Investigators determined that the time of death for Sherry and the boys occurred long before Chris claimed to have left for the gym, meaning he was home when they were killed. Neighbors reported not hearing any screaming, likely because the victims had been strangled silently in their sleep. The community of Columbia was in disbelief. How could a father kill his own children, two boys who adored him, and then pretend to be the grieving husband? The local church held vigils, and hundreds of people gathered to light candles for Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. Friends described Sherry as loving, compassionate, and patient. They said she had been trying desperately to save her marriage, unaware that her husband had already decided their fate. When Chris attended the funerals, his demeanor disturbed many who saw him. He wore sunglasses, spoke little, and seemed detached, almost robotic. There were whispers that he was acting. Even his own family began to question him privately, unable to reconcile the image of the disciplined Marine and devout Christian with the monster now being described by investigators. By late 2009, the case against Chris Coleman had become overwhelming. Forensic evidence, digital footprints, surveillance records, and his affair with Tara all pointed to one conclusion. He had murdered his wife and sons to escape his marriage and pursue a new life. His motive was painfully clear. He wanted freedom, but without the shame of divorce, without losing his job, and without facing judgment from his religious community. In May 2010, nearly a year after the murders, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. His mugshot, cold and expressionless, circulated through the media as the story became a national obsession. The case wasn't just about a family tragedy. It was about hypocrisy, hidden sin, and how a man trusted by millions could commit an act so inhuman. The small town of Columbia would never be the same again. The Coleman house, once filled with laughter, now stood empty, a chilling reminder of how darkness can live behind the brightest facades. And as prosecutors prepared for trial, one thing became clear. Chris Coleman's web of lies had finally caught up to him. The truth, no matter how deeply buried beneath his deceit, was about to be laid bare before the world. The trial of Chris Coleman would become one of the most watched and emotionally charged court cases in the history of Illinois. For 2 years, the story had haunted Columbia, a picturesque town forever scarred by betrayal. People who once attended church with the Colemans, who had shared dinners and family gatherings, now sat in courtroom benches, waiting to hear how and why a man could destroy everything he claimed to protect. The courtroom itself was tense and heavy, filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and friends of the victims. At the center sat Chris Coleman, dressed neatly in a suit, expression stoic, eyes cold. The same man who had once preached family values now faced the unbearable truth of his own actions. Prosecutors presented their case with precision and quiet fury. They laid out every detail of Chris's double life. His affair with Tara Lintz, his fake threatening emails, his meticulous staging of the crime scene. They argued that this wasn't a crime of passion or sudden rage, but a deliberate, calculated plan born from selfishness and deceit. They described how Chris had strangled his wife and sons one by one, in their sleep, ensuring that none of them would have the chance to fight back or cry for help. It was cold, intimate, and methodical, the act of someone who wanted to erase his old life entirely. To the jury, the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution displayed the fake email threats that Chris had sent from his own computer, tracing every digital fingerprint back to him. They showed text messages exchanged between him and Tara, messages filled with love and plans for a new future. Messages sent just days before the murders. They revealed cell phone records proving that while his family was dying in their beds, he was already crafting the alibi of a concerned husband heading to the gym. Surveillance footage showed his car leaving home far earlier than he claimed, aligning perfectly with the estimated time of death. Detectives testified about the crime scene. They spoke of how the red spray paint on the walls matched the cans found in Chris's garage, and how the writing seemed rushed and unnatural, almost staged. They described the eerie calm of the house. No forced entry, no stolen items, nothing missing. The only thing out of place was the life that had been stolen from within it. The lead investigator, his voice steady but grim, told the jury, "This was not the work of an intruder. This was the work of a man who wanted his family gone." Then came the most heartbreaking testimony of all, the forensic pathologist who examined the bodies. The courtroom fell silent as the doctor explained the cause of death for Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin. Each had been manually strangled, their bodies showing signs of pressure and bruising around the neck. Sherry had likely been killed first, then the boys. The detail that shattered even the most stoic faces in the room was that one of the boys, likely Garrett, may have woken up during the attack, only to be overpowered by his father. The notion that a child's last moments were spent looking into the eyes of the man meant to protect him was too much for many to bear. Chris's defense team struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. They argued that the police had rushed to judgment, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that someone else could have broken in and framed him. But without any sign of forced entry, without any fingerprints or DNA from another person, the theory collapsed under its own weight. When Chris took the stand, his testimony was emotionless. He denied everything. He claimed he loved his wife and children, that he had been faithful, that the threatening emails were real. But every word he spoke felt hollow, mechanical, rehearsed. Observers in the courtroom noticed how detached he appeared, as though he were discussing someone else's tragedy rather than his own family's murder. The prosecution's closing argument was direct and devastating. They told the jury that Chris Coleman had valued his image more than his family. He wanted freedom, wealth, and passion with his mistress, but he didn't want to face the public shame of divorce or risk losing his prestigious job at Joyce Meyer Ministries. So, he chose the most monstrous solution imaginable, to kill the very people who trusted him the most. He didn't lose control, the prosecutor said. He made a choice to strangle his wife while she slept. A choice to end the lives of two innocent boys who loved him. A choice to paint over his sins in red and call it punishment. This was not anger. This was evil. After days of testimony and weeks of emotional turmoil, the jury retired to deliberate. It took them only a few hours to reach a verdict. On May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murders, Chris Coleman was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, he showed little reaction, only staring straight ahead, his face pale and expressionless. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs. Sherry's family embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces as justice was finally served, though no sentence could ever bring their loved ones back. At sentencing, the judge delivered a statement that would be remembered long after the trial ended. He told Chris that what he had done was the ultimate betrayal, not only of his wife and children but of every principle he claimed to stand for. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge's words cut through the silence of the courtroom. You took their lives for your own selfish gain, and you will spend the rest of yours behind bars. In the years that followed, the Coleman murders continued to haunt Columbia. The house where it happened stood empty for a long time, a grim reminder of the tragedy that unfolded behind its walls. Neighbors said they could never drive past it without remembering the laughter of 2 young boys playing in the yard or Sherry's warm smile as she waved from the porch. Eventually, the home was sold and repainted, but the memories could not be erased. For many in the community, it became a symbol, a painful lesson that evil can wear the face of normalcy. Joyce Meyer publicly expressed her grief and shock, saying that the case had changed the way she viewed trust and accountability within her organization. Tara Lintz disappeared from the public eye, reportedly devastated by the truth that the man she loved was a murderer. Sherry's parents, who had lost their only daughter and grandsons, became advocates for domestic violence awareness, warning others about the signs of emotional control and manipulation that can escalate into tragedy. Inside prison, Chris Coleman has lived a quiet, isolated existence. Those who have seen him describe a man who rarely speaks, who spends most of his time reading or writing letters, though few believe he has ever shown true remorse. He continues to maintain his innocence, but the evidence, the overwhelming, inescapable truth, will always define him. The story of the Coleman family stands as one of the darkest examples of deception and betrayal in modern true crime history. It is a reminder that behind polished smiles and perfect family photos, unimaginable darkness can hide. A husband who pretended to protect his family chose to destroy it instead, believing he could rewrite his life without consequence. But in the end, his lies collapsed, his mask was torn away, and the truth stood exposed, that love, when replaced by greed and selfishness, can become the most dangerous illusion of all. A perfect family, 6 beautiful children, and 2 loving mothers, until one horrifying drive off a California cliff exposed the terrifying truth behind their smiles. The Hart family tragedy wasn't an accident. It was a meticulously planned murder-suicide that shocked the world. This is the haunting story behind the illusion. It was a gray, misty morning on March 26, 2018, when a tourist driving along California's Pacific Coast Highway noticed something strange. Down below, at the base of a rugged cliff in Mendocino County, the dark roof of an SUV was visible among the rocks and ocean foam. The vehicle had fallen more than 100 feet. There were no skid marks, no signs of braking, just silence and the steady roar of waves crashing against the shore. When first responders arrived, they expected a tragic accident. But what they uncovered would soon become one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern America. Inside the crumpled GMC Yukon were the bodies of Jennifer and Sarah Hart, a married couple from Washington state. Near them lay 3 of their 6 adopted children, Marcus, Abigail, and Jeremiah, lifeless and broken. The remaining three, Hannah, Devontae, and Sierra, were nowhere to be found. Their bodies were never recovered, likely swept away by the tide. Within hours, as investigators began piecing together the timeline, it became clear this was no ordinary crash. The car's black box revealed that Jennifer Hart had accelerated intentionally, pushing the gas pedal to the floor. The speedometer froze at nearly 90 miles per hour. To the outside world, Jennifer and Sarah Hart were the image of love and acceptance. They were white women raising 6 adopted black children in a home that seemed full of compassion. On Facebook, Jennifer posted smiling photos of the family at festivals, road trips, and volunteer events. They attended rallies promoting unity and peace. Their image was so perfect it bordered on cinematic, matching outfits, cheerful captions, and the aura of a family bonded by something bigger than blood. But those who had met the Harts in person sometimes sensed something off. The kids were polite but quiet. They rarely spoke unless spoken to. Their eyes carried a look that some described as nervous obedience. Behind closed doors, the story was far darker than the photos suggested. The Hart children had come from 2 biological families, all victims of neglect and poverty before being placed in foster care. Jennifer and Sarah presented themselves as rescuers, 2 women eager to provide love and opportunity. They adopted Marcus, Hannah, and Abigail first, and later brought in Devontae, Jeremiah, and Sierra. But over the years, teachers, neighbors, and even relatives began noticing troubling signs. The children appeared underfed, often arriving at school hungry or complaining they hadn't eaten. They wore long sleeves in warm weather, as if hiding bruises. One teacher recalled Hannah begging for food during lunch, saying she was being punished with starvation at home. In 2011, those concerns became official when Sarah Hart pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor domestic assault charge. A teacher had noticed bruises on one of the children. Sarah admitted she had hit her daughter, and though she avoided jail, Child Protection Services, CPS, began keeping an eye on the family. After that incident, Jennifer pulled the kids out of school entirely, choosing to homeschool them instead. It was a move that isolated the children even further. Jennifer controlled every aspect of their lives. Friends described her as charismatic yet dominating, the kind of person who could manipulate situations to her advantage. Her social media posts weren't just family updates. They were carefully crafted performances. She shaped the family's public image like a director controlling a film set. The smiling photos, the colorful outings, the stories of love and struggle. They were all pieces of a facade built to conceal years of abuse and fear. Sarah, in contrast, was quiet and submissive, seemingly under Jennifer's influence. She worked outside the home and rarely spoke publicly. But text messages later found on her phone revealed a woman deeply unhappy, fearful, and complicit. In private conversations with coworkers, Sarah admitted that Jennifer was abusive and controlling, yet she never acted to protect the children. By 2017, the cracks in their illusion were beginning to show. The family had moved to Woodland, Washington, in search of a fresh start. But soon after settling in, the children's behavior alarmed their new neighbors. One night, Hannah, then 16, ran to the home of Bruce and Dana DeKalb next door. She was trembling and begged for help, saying her parents were racists who abused them, starved them, and whipped them with belts. The DeKalbs were shocked. They comforted her, but within minutes, Jennifer arrived, insisting that Hannah was lying because of a family argument. She apologized profusely and promised it wouldn't happen again. The DeKalbs believed her at first, but over the following months, they began noticing other strange things. The children rarely came outside, and when they did, they looked frail and quiet. Devontae sometimes visited asking for food, saying his parents weren't feeding them. In March 2018, the DeKalbs contacted CPS. They reported what Hannah had said, what they'd observed, and their growing fear that something terrible might happen. CPS took the complaint seriously. On March 23rd, a social worker arrived at the Hart home to conduct a welfare check. The white Yukon was parked outside, but no one answered the door. The worker left a business card, planning to return a few days later. But by then, it was too late. Sometime between March 23rd and March 26th, Jennifer and Sarah made their final decision. Investigators later found that Sarah had been searching online for how much Benadryl is lethal and can drowning cause death in children. Jennifer's blood alcohol content was found to be over the legal limit, and Sarah and the children had significant levels of Benadryl in their systems. The drug likely made them drowsy or unconscious before the crash. It appeared that the two women had planned the deaths meticulously, choosing a remote section of Highway 1 where the cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean. What drove them to this point remains a haunting question. Some believe Jennifer feared losing control. CPS was closing in, and the perfect image she had built over the years was about to shatter. Rather than face exposure, she decided that if she couldn't maintain that image, she would destroy it completely. To her twisted mind, ending all their lives together preserved the illusion of unity. When the car was pulled from the water, rescuers were overcome by the horror of what they found. The children were still buckled in their seats, their faces peaceful as if asleep. There was no sign of struggle, no indication they even knew what was happening. The ocean had swallowed the rest, leaving behind a devastating mystery. As investigators began sorting through the evidence, they realized this was not just the story of one family. It was the story of how society's systems, blinded by appearances, failed 6 innocent children. The Hart family's tragedy marked the end of their carefully constructed world. But for the rest of America, it was just the beginning of understanding how something so monstrous could hide behind such a perfect smile. The investigation that followed the discovery of the Hart family SUV at the base of the cliff was one of disbelief, sorrow, and outrage. Detectives from Mendocino County Sheriff's Office and California Highway Patrol initially treated the case as a tragic accident, but the evidence soon began telling a story that no one wanted to believe. The SUV's black box revealed that the vehicle's speed never decreased before impact. The accelerator had been fully pressed, and the engine roared to its maximum as it flew over the edge. It was deliberate, an intentional act of destruction. The driver, Jennifer Hart, had chosen death not only for herself but for 6 children who trusted her completely. The questions started piling up. Who were these 2 women? How did a couple so publicly celebrated as loving mothers and advocates for equality come to commit such a horrific act? As investigators delved deeper, a chilling portrait began to emerge. Jennifer and Sarah Hart had been running from the truth for years, moving from one state to another, avoiding the scrutiny of child welfare agencies, and carefully curating a digital illusion of happiness. The crash site, investigators realized, was not the scene of an accident, but the final act of a long, hidden tragedy. Detectives began retracing the family's last known movements. Credit card records showed that on March 23, 2018, just hours after the CPS visit to their home in Woodland, Washington, Jennifer and Sarah purchased food and supplies. Witnesses recalled seeing the Yukon packed full, the children silent in their seats. At a Safeway grocery store in Fort Bragg, California, security footage captured Jennifer buying snacks and alcohol, while Sarah stood behind her, expressionless. Nothing about their demeanor hinted at what was coming. They seemed calm, methodical, even resigned. Investigators also found evidence inside the vehicle: a half-empty bottle of whiskey, children's clothing, and personal belongings. Toxicology results confirmed what the medical examiners feared. Jennifer had been heavily intoxicated. Her blood alcohol level was 0.10, above the legal limit. Sarah and the children had high levels of Benadryl in their systems, enough to make them drowsy or unconscious. It was clear Jennifer had been driving while drunk, while Sarah sat silently beside her, both knowing they were taking their family toward the end. Meanwhile, detectives began piecing together the history of the family through interviews, documents, and old CPS records. The picture that formed was devastating. Over a decade, the Hart women had been investigated multiple times for child neglect and abuse in Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. Each time, they slipped through the cracks of the system. Teachers, neighbors, and friends had reported the children's malnourishment, strange behavior, and fear of punishment. In one case, Hannah told her teacher that she had bruises because she fell down the stairs, though her story changed under questioning. When authorities got close, the family would simply move to another state, starting fresh with a new address, new school district, and a new version of their story. Jennifer controlled every narrative. She was the charismatic one, the talker. Her Facebook page painted a picture of a free-spirited, socially conscious family who loved nature, equality, and peace. They attended festivals and marches, often posing for photographs that reinforced their ideal image. When the famous 2014 photo of Devontae hugging a Portland police officer went viral, Jennifer seized the moment. The image became a symbol of racial unity and love, and she used it to reinforce their reputation as selfless parents raising children with compassion. Yet, in the shadows of that fame, the children's suffering deepened. In private, Jennifer ruled through fear. The children were forced to remain quiet, disciplined, and obedient. They were punished for the smallest infractions, laughing too loudly, taking food without permission, or showing defiance. They were often deprived of meals as punishment, made to lie still for hours, and isolated from each other. Sarah's role was complex. Text messages later recovered from her phone revealed a woman trapped in guilt and submission. She texted co-workers that Jennifer's anger frightened her, that the children were struggling, and that she felt powerless to stop it. In one message, she described the kids as being in trouble all the time and admitted they were sometimes denied food for days. But Sarah never reported the abuse to authorities. Whether out of fear or complicity, she became part of the cycle that would lead to the children's deaths. As the investigation continued, interviews with neighbors painted an even clearer picture. In Woodland, Washington, the DeKalbs told police about Hannah's desperate escape attempt. They described how she had banged on their door, shaking and pleading for protection. The next day, Jennifer had come to their home, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. For months afterward, the DeKalbs noticed the children becoming thinner, quieter, and more isolated. Devontae, the same child who once smiled in viral photographs, began visiting their home asking for food, apples, tortillas, or peanut butter. He whispered that his parents weren't feeding them and that he was scared. The DeKalbs called CPS in early 2018, fearing the children's lives were in danger. By March, CPS was actively investigating. A social worker arrived at the Hart residence, but no one answered. The house appeared occupied but silent. Days later, the SUV was gone. Investigators now believe that after the welfare visit, Jennifer and Sarah realized their secret life was about to collapse. The illusion of the perfect family could no longer protect them. They faced exposure, possible loss of custody, and criminal charges. Rather than face that reality, Jennifer made her fatal choice. Experts who studied the case later described Jennifer's mindset as a combination of narcissism and control. Her entire identity depended on being seen as the savior of these children, the model of love and social awareness. When she sensed that image breaking apart, she couldn't bear the humiliation or the loss of control. The decision to drive off the cliff was her way of maintaining power to the end. If she couldn't have the children, no one could. The evidence of long-term abuse became impossible to deny. Autopsy reports revealed signs of malnutrition and past injuries. Investigators found that the children were severely underweight for their ages. Digital evidence showed months of online searches for suicide methods, sedatives, and how to avoid leaving skid marks during a car crash. It was planned, deliberate, and calculated. Sarah's searches included phrases like, "How much Benadryl for a 120-pound person?" and "death by drowning or fall." In her final hours, she texted a friend that she was feeling sick and tired, though she gave no indication of what was to come. The story captivated and horrified the nation. People struggled to understand how a family that symbolized love and inclusion could harbor such darkness. News outlets replayed the same smiling photos from Facebook, juxtaposed with the grim images of the cliffside wreckage. Reporters visited the family's former homes, uncovering a trail of missed warning signs and unheeded calls for help. Each revelation deepened the tragedy. Teachers silenced by privacy laws, neighbors ignored by overworked agencies, social workers limited by red tape. As the truth unfolded, one haunting fact remained. The children had no voice left to tell their own story. Their lives were defined by control, and their deaths became a symbol of a system that failed them at every turn. The Hart family's fall from grace wasn't sudden. It was a slow, hidden collapse that began years before the car ever left the ground. And while investigators pieced together the evidence of intent and abuse, one question echoed across the nation. How many people saw the signs and didn't act soon enough? By the end of Part 2, it was clear that the Hart tragedy wasn't just about one family's destruction. It was about the illusion of perfection that blinded everyone around them. And as the investigation continued, the final chapter would reveal how every warning, every cry for help, and every missed chance led, inch by inch, to the edge of that cliff. In the weeks following the discovery of the Hart family SUV, the small coastal towns of Northern California were filled with grief, disbelief, and anger. The Pacific Ocean that had swallowed the family's car became both a symbol and a witness to the horrifying decision that ended 6 young lives. As investigators worked through every detail of the case, what emerged was a devastating story not only of 2 parents who lost control, but of a system that had failed to protect the most vulnerable. The Hart tragedy was not a sudden event. It was the final act in a pattern of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and the illusion of a perfect family carefully constructed for the world to see. Search teams continued scouring the coastline for weeks after the crash, hoping to recover the 3 missing children, Devontae, Hannah, and Sierra. The powerful waves and steep cliffs made the task nearly impossible. Bits of clothing and small personal items washed up on nearby beaches, but no human remains were ever conclusively identified. Eventually, the search was scaled back, and their names were added to the growing list of victims. The official cause of death for all 6 children was ruled as homicide, and both Jennifer and Sarah were listed as responsible. Investigators concluded that Jennifer had been the driver, and Sarah, knowing what was coming, did nothing to stop her. As the truth solidified, the public's shock deepened. Social media, once Jennifer's stage for portraying a fantasy life, now became the battleground for outrage and heartbreak. Thousands of people who had followed the family online began revisiting old photos and captions, reading them in a new, horrifying context. Images that once appeared joyful, birthday parties, camping trips, moments of laughter, were now viewed as evidence of control and performance. The smiling children in matching outfits weren't symbols of love but victims of a narrative crafted to mask suffering. Reporters and psychologists began to call it the Instagram family illusion, the dangerous gap between online perfection and hidden abuse. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the Hart family tragedy could have been prevented. Child Protective Services across 3 states, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington, had all received multiple reports about neglect and abuse. Teachers had raised concerns, neighbors had reported strange behavior, and even relatives of the children's biological families had tried to sound the alarm. But each report was isolated, trapped within the bureaucracy of different state systems. When the Harts moved, their records didn't follow them completely. Old reports vanished into paperwork. Each new community saw them as a fresh, happy family, unaware of the hidden history that followed behind. In interviews with reporters, neighbors like Bruce and Dana DeKalb expressed their regret and guilt. They described how they had watched the family with growing unease, feeling powerless to intervene beyond calling authorities. Dana remembered how Devontae would come to her door asking for food, whispering that his parents were cruel. She said his eyes carried both fear and hope, fear of what would happen if Jennifer found out, and hope that someone would help them before it was too late. For the DeKalbs, the knowledge that their calls to CPS came only days before the fatal drive became an unbearable burden. "We tried," Bruce said quietly to a reporter. "But it wasn't enough." The case sparked widespread national debate about how social services track at-risk families, especially those who move across state lines. Lawmakers, advocates, and journalists began asking how such obvious red flags could have been missed. Records showed that each state's child welfare agency had received reports years apart, but none had fully connected the pattern of behavior. In some cases, Investigators visited the Hart home but accepted Jennifer's explanations without further verification. Her calm demeanor, articulate speech, and professional presentation disarmed many of them. She was persuasive, convincing everyone that she was a devoted mother being unfairly targeted. Meanwhile, the children's voices, when they dared to speak, were dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. The tragedy also reignited conversations about racial dynamics in adoption. Jennifer and Sarah were white women raising 6 black children, and while they presented their family as a story of love transcending race, critics argued that the power imbalance made it easier for their abuse to go unnoticed. Some advocates pointed out that when black children are adopted by white parents, cultural and systemic biases can make authorities less likely to intervene. The Harts were celebrated for their supposed compassion and open-mindedness, but few questioned how they controlled every aspect of the children's lives, including their ability to speak freely. In the months after the crash, journalists revisited every stage of the family's life. Former neighbors from Minnesota remembered the children as polite but withdrawn, never playing outside or attending parties. A teacher from Oregon recalled a day when one of the kids arrived at school with bruises, only for Jennifer to pull all the children out the next week, claiming she would homeschool them. Each person had a fragment of the story, but no one had seen the entire picture until it was too late. One of the most heartbreaking revelations came from Sarah's phone records. Investigators found text messages between her and Jennifer in the days before the crash. The tone was heavy, fatalistic. Sarah expressed fear that the CPS investigation would ruin their lives. Jennifer replied that the world was against them and that people wouldn't understand their family's love. In one chilling message, Sarah asked if they were doing the right thing, to which Jennifer responded simply, "It's time. They'll be safe this way." Those words, investigators later said, captured the warped reasoning behind their decision. A belief that death was a form of protection from a world they believed had turned against them. As the case reached its official conclusion, Mendocino County Sheriff Tom Ullman held a press conference summarizing the findings. His voice was steady but heavy with emotion as he confirmed that the crash was intentional. "This was a crime," he said. "A murder-suicide. These children had no choice." The final report condemned the failures of multiple agencies but also acknowledged the complexity of the deception. Jennifer and Sarah had built a fortress of lies strong enough to fool everyone around them, until it crumbled on the edge of that cliff. Over time, the story of the Hart family became a cautionary tale across the United States. Documentaries, news specials, and investigative podcasts explored the themes of control, image, and systemic negligence. Experts called it a tragedy of appearances, warning how social media's glossy perfection can hide real suffering. The Harts had weaponized the very thing that brought them admiration, their image, and used it to mask the truth. The children's smiles, their coordinated clothing, and their cheerful poses became symbols of silent endurance under the weight of control. Today, the site of the crash remains quiet, a stretch of highway overlooking the vast Pacific, where tourists often stop to take pictures, unaware of the horror that once unfolded there. Small memorials appear from time to time. Flowers, photos, candles, and handwritten notes left by strangers who still mourn 6 children they never knew. Some write messages of apology, others of sorrow, and a few with promises that their story will never be forgotten. In the end, the Hart family tragedy was more than a story of murder. It was a story of illusion, fear, and systemic failure. It revealed how easily truth can be buried under the weight of perception, and how fragile the boundary between love and control can be when left unchecked. Jennifer and Sarah Hart took their family to the edge of the world, believing they could control the ending of their story. But what they couldn't control was what came after. The collective reckoning of a nation forced to confront the darkness that hid behind one family's perfect smile. An innocent 8-year-old boy, a home filled with unimaginable horror, and a system that looked the other way. The story of Gabriel Fernandez isn't just a crime. It's a mirror reflecting society's deepest failure. What happened behind those closed doors will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. In the quiet community of Palmdale, California, where suburban streets stretched endlessly under the desert sun, Few could imagine the horrors unfolding inside one modest apartment. It was 2013 when the story of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez would soon shake not only this small town but the entire nation. Behind the walls of an ordinary home, a tragedy was taking shape, one that revealed not only the cruelty of two adults but also the deep cracks in a system meant to protect children like Gabriel. His was a life filled with small hopes, gentle dreams, and innocent questions. Dreams that were slowly crushed by the very people who were supposed to love him most. Gabriel's life began like that of any child, full of potential and promise. Born on February 20, 2005, he was described by family members as bright and affectionate, a boy who smiled easily and loved animals. His relatives recalled that he had a particular fondness for police officers and often said he wanted to become one someday. For the first years of his life, Gabriel lived with his great-uncle and his partner, who provided the love and stability Pearl Fernandez had failed to give. But that fragile security was ripped away in 2012 when Pearl suddenly demanded custody of her son. Authorities granted her request, unaware that it would be the beginning of Gabriel's descent into unimaginable torment. When Gabriel moved into his mother's apartment, he was introduced to a new figure in his life, Isoro Aguirre, Pearl's boyfriend. At first glance, Aguirre appeared to be calm and polite, even gentle. He was a former security guard, described by colleagues as soft-spoken and courteous. But beneath that mild demeanor lurked a man with a dangerous temper and a twisted obsession with power. Together, Pearl and Aguirre created a toxic environment built on control and cruelty. They began targeting Gabriel almost immediately, singling him out from his siblings, Ezekiel and Virginia. To the outside world, they were a family trying to make things work. Behind closed doors, they were becoming monsters. The abuse started small, harsh words, punishments that seemed excessive, nights without food. But soon it grew darker. Gabriel's teachers began noticing bruises and scratches that couldn't be easily explained. When asked what happened, the boy whispered answers that made the adults uneasy. "My mom hits me," he said softly one day. On another, he told his teacher that his mother made him eat things that weren't food. Jennifer Garcia, his first-grade teacher, was alarmed. She contacted the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. Caseworkers visited the home but left believing Pearl's version of events, that Gabriel was clumsy, that his bruises were accidents. Each time Gabriel was sent back home, the abuse escalated. Inside that apartment, Gabriel's world turned into a daily nightmare. Aguirre often accused him of being gay, calling him names and beating him for playing with dolls or showing affection. These acts were not mere punishment, they were deliberate torture. He was forced to eat spoiled food, pepper, and cat litter. He was locked inside a small cabinet for hours, gagged, and left in the dark. The other children watched helplessly, terrified they might be next. Ezekiel and Virginia tried to comfort him when they could, sneaking him bits of food or whispering reassurance, but they were only children themselves. Fear kept them silent. Pearl Fernandez, meanwhile, did little to protect her son. Some would later argue she was afraid of Aguirre, but witnesses and evidence revealed she was an active participant. She joined in the beatings, shouted insults, and withheld food. At times, she stood by and watched as Aguirre's fists struck her son's fragile body. Gabriel's small frame bore the evidence. Bruises, burns, and scars that told a story words could never fully capture. The cruelty was systematic, the intent deliberate. Every action seemed designed to break him, to erase his sense of self-worth. As weeks turned into months, Gabriel's teachers grew desperate. Jennifer Garcia made multiple reports, each one pleading for intervention. She wasn't alone. Other school staff joined her, noticing that Gabriel often came to school in dirty clothes, hungry, and visibly in pain. One day, he arrived with chunks of hair missing and BB gun welts on his face. "Who did this to you?" she asked. Gabriel looked down, his voice barely audible. "My mom and her boyfriend." The words chilled her, yet again the reports went nowhere. The social workers documented the claims but failed to act decisively. The boy was left in danger, and the system failed him again and again. For Gabriel, home became a prison. Each night was filled with fear, fear of the next beating, of the next punishment for something as innocent as smiling or speaking out of turn. Aguirre's obsession with control grew more violent, and Pearl's complicity deepened. When Gabriel was too weak to stand, they mocked him. When he cried, they told him no one cared. To survive, he retreated inward, clinging to the faint hope that someone would rescue him. That hope flickered each day at school, where the kindness of his teacher and classmates offered brief moments of light in his otherwise dark world. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the agencies tasked with protecting children were drowning in bureaucracy and indifference. The Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services had a long history of missed opportunities, overworked staff, and poor communication. In Gabriel's case, there were multiple red flags, each documented, each ignored. Caseworkers failed to see the urgency, and supervisors dismissed the warnings. Their reports became paperwork rather than life-saving actions. When one social worker visited, Gabriel reportedly told her directly that he was being beaten. She marked the file and left. No one returned. As the months passed, Gabriel's condition worsened. His once bright eyes dulled with exhaustion. His body became frail from starvation and injury, and still no one intervened. The cruelty reached a level that seemed beyond comprehension. He was shot with a BB gun for amusement, forced to eat spoiled leftovers, and made to sleep bound and gagged in a cupboard so small that he could barely move. The only sounds in the night were his muffled cries that never reached the ears of those who could have saved him. The first cracks in the family's illusion of normalcy began to show. Neighbors heard yelling and strange noises but assumed it was a domestic dispute. Nothing more. They saw Gabriel sometimes standing quietly outside, looking thin and withdrawn, but no one imagined the scale of what was happening. Even within the home, the siblings were struggling to cope. Ezekiel later recalled that he prayed every night for his little brother's safety, even as he feared it was too late. By early May 2013, the abuse had reached its peak. Gabriel's body could no longer endure the torment. He was covered in bruises, scars, and burns, his bones brittle and his spirit nearly gone. And yet, that week, teachers still saw glimpses of hope. A faint smile when someone asked him about his dream of becoming a police officer. It was as if, even in his suffering, Gabriel still believed in justice. But justice, at least for now, was nowhere to be found. The clock was ticking toward the tragedy that would soon expose every failure, every ignored warning, and every cruel act that had stolen his childhood. By the time paramedics would finally be called, it would be too late. For months, Gabriel had endured unimaginable pain, hoping for help that never came. The people who should have protected him, his mother, the system, society itself, had looked away. And as the final days of his young life approached, the story of Gabriel Fernandez was about to become not just a crime story, but a haunting lesson in the cost of silence and neglect. The night of May 22, 2013, was suffocatingly still in Palmdale when the 911 call came through. Paramedics rushed to the small apartment where 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez lay motionless, his small body battered and bruised beyond recognition. When first responders arrived, they found Pearl Fernandez standing by, her face expressionless, and Isoro Aguirre claiming that Gabriel had fallen. But the scene told another story. The boy was naked, unconscious, covered in open wounds, burn marks, and bruises in every stage of healing. His skull was fractured, ribs broken, and BB pellets embedded under his skin. The signs of long-term torture were unmistakable. As paramedics worked frantically to save him, the reality of the horror within that home began to unfold. Gabriel was rushed to Antelope Valley Hospital and then transferred to Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where doctors were horrified by what they saw. His body told the story of prolonged and deliberate abuse. His brain had swollen from blunt force trauma, his teeth were broken, and his skin bore the marks of repeated beatings. Medical staff struggled to understand how a child could suffer so much without intervention. As they worked to keep him alive, the question began circulating among them. How could this have gone unnoticed? It was clear to everyone in that room, this was not an accident. This was torture. At the hospital, detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department were called in to investigate. The lead investigator, Detective Chris Calderon, would later describe the scene as one of the most disturbing of his career. When questioned, Pearl and Aguirre's stories quickly unraveled. Aguirre claimed Gabriel had fallen while playing, but evidence contradicted every word. His hands bore fresh bruises consistent with punching. His demeanor, calm and detached, only deepened the officer's suspicions. Pearl, meanwhile, tried to portray herself as a frightened mother, saying Aguirre was controlling and violent. But when detectives compared her statements to the evidence and to testimony from Gabriel's siblings, the truth became undeniable. She was not a bystander. She was an active participant. While Gabriel lay in a coma, his brother Ezekiel and sister Virginia were taken into protective custody. Their statements to authorities painted a picture far worse than anyone imagined. Ezekiel described in haunting detail how Aguirre and Pearl had systematically tortured Gabriel for months. He told investigators how they would make his brother sleep-bound and gagged in a cabinet, shoot him with BB guns, force him to eat spoiled food, and beat him until he bled. Sometimes, Pearl would laugh while Aguirre punched him in the face. The children also revealed that Aguirre had made Gabriel eat cat feces as punishment, and when he cried, he was hit even harder. Those confessions shattered any illusion that this was spontaneous violence. It was premeditated cruelty. Doctors fought to save Gabriel's life for 2 long days. Machines kept his small heart beating, but his brain activity was minimal. As his relatives gathered, tears filled the sterile hospital room. His grandfather, his uncle, and other family members who had once cared for him stood in disbelief, wondering how this could have happened after so many pleas for help had been ignored. On May 24, 2013, Gabriel Fernandez was pronounced dead. His death certificate would later list the cause as blunt force trauma and neglect. But for those who knew the full story, the true cause was systemic failure. Failure by his mother, failure by social workers, failure by the system itself. The arrest of Pearl Fernandez and Isoro Aguirre followed immediately. Both were charged with capital murder and a special circumstance of torture. When Aguirre was taken into custody, officers noted he showed little emotion, calmly admitting that he had hit Gabriel because he didn't like him. His lack of remorse was chilling. Pearl, on the other hand, attempted to shift blame entirely onto her boyfriend, claiming she had been too scared to stop him. But investigators discovered text messages, witness statements, and physical evidence proving she had joined in the abuse. She had not only condoned Aguirre's actions but had participated in the torment. As detectives pieced together the timeline of Gabriel's suffering, another disturbing truth emerged. Multiple opportunities to save him had been missed. Records from the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services showed that at least 4 separate abuse reports had been filed. Teachers had called repeatedly. Social workers had visited the home. Each time, the investigation was either closed or downgraded. No follow-up visits, no removal from the home, no protection. The case files revealed a bureaucratic indifference that seemed impossible to justify. Emails between supervisors later showed how reports were often lost or ignored due to heavy caseloads and mismanagement. In the aftermath, those social workers would become central figures in the legal firestorm that followed. As word of Gabriel's death spread, public outrage erupted across California. The story dominated headlines, sparking protests, candlelight vigils, and demands for accountability. Parents, teachers, and activists gathered outside government offices holding signs that read, "Justice for Gabriel." Reporters began digging into the history of child abuse cases mishandled by county officials. The horrifying details of Gabriel's final months, being locked in a cabinet, shot with a BB gun, starved, and beaten, were splashed across every newspaper and television screen. The public wanted answers, and the justice system was forced to confront its own failures. During the initial court hearings, prosecutors painted Aguirre as a man consumed by hatred and cruelty. They argued that he saw Gabriel as weak and targeted him with unrelenting violence. Deputy District Attorney Jonathan Hadami described the torture in excruciating detail, calling it systematic and intentional. He showed jurors photographs of Gabriel's injuries, the BB pellets lodged under his skin, and the bruises that covered nearly every inch of his body. The courtroom fell silent as the images were displayed. Even seasoned reporters struggled to hold back tears. Meanwhile, the defense tried to humanize Aguirre, portraying him as a man manipulated by Pearl Fernandez. They claimed Pearl controlled him emotionally and encouraged the abuse. But this argument crumbled when witnesses testified to Aguirre's dominating personality and Pearl's willingness to join in. One chilling moment came when prosecutors played recorded interviews with Ezekiel and Virginia, where the children recounted the nights they heard Gabriel screaming for help. Their small voices filled the courtroom, exposing the evil that had lived inside that apartment. Forensic experts testified that Gabriel's injuries were consistent with long-term abuse. His skull fractures were not the result of a single blow but repeated trauma. Old injuries revealed a pattern: broken ribs that had healed, burns that were weeks old, and wounds that had become infected. The evidence left no doubt. Gabriel had been tortured to death. Jurors listened in horror as prosecutors described how the boy was beaten for things like not cleaning his toys or for being gay. The absurdity and cruelty of those reasons reflected the deep-rooted malice of his abusers. As the trial continued, focus began to shift toward accountability beyond Pearl and Aguirre. The media spotlight turned on the social workers and supervisors who had ignored warning signs. For employees of the Department of Children and Family Services, Patricia Clement, Gregory Merritt, Kevin Bom, and Stephanie Rodriguez were charged with child abuse and falsifying records. Prosecutors accused them of negligence that directly contributed to Gabriel's death. It was an unprecedented move, charging government employees for their failure to act in a child abuse case. Though their charges were later overturned, the message was clear. The system itself was on trial. In the midst of court proceedings, the story began resonating far beyond Los Angeles County. People across the United States watched in disbelief as the details of Gabriel's life and death emerged. Documentaries, news specials, and community discussions began exploring how such a tragedy could occur in a country with an entire network of child protection agencies. Questions arose about training, accountability, and the very philosophy of child welfare. Why had Gabriel's cries been ignored? Why had the reports been closed without real investigation? And how many other children were suffering in silence? The answers were not simple, but what was clear was that Gabriel Fernandez's death had become a turning point. It was no longer just about one child, it was about a broken system and the countless others it failed to protect. And as the courtroom drama continued, one thing became certain: justice for Gabriel would not be achieved merely through punishment. It would require a reckoning with the failures that had allowed his suffering to continue unchecked, right up until his final breath. The trial of Isoro Aguirre and Pearl Fernandez would become one of the most closely followed criminal cases in California's history. By the time it began in 2017, 4 years had passed since Gabriel's death, but the memory of his suffering still haunted the public. The courtroom was packed each day with journalists, advocates, and citizens who had come to witness the pursuit of justice for a child whose voice had been silenced. Outside, protesters gathered with candles and signs bearing his photograph. A small boy with bright eyes and a shy smile. Inside, the details of his torture were laid bare, piece by piece, in testimony that would shake even seasoned prosecutors and jurors to their core. Deputy District Attorney Jonathan Hadami led the prosecution, his voice firm but emotional as he described the cruelty inflicted upon Gabriel. The evidence was overwhelming: medical reports, photographs, witness statements, and physical injuries that spoke louder than any words. Hadami told jurors that Gabriel had been targeted because Aguirre believed he was gay, and Pearl allowed it. He was abused, beaten, shot, and starved, Hadami said. He was a child who wanted to be loved. The prosecution argued that the abuse was not random, but deliberate, systematic, and motivated by hatred. Each injury, they said, represented a calculated act of control and domination. During the proceedings, the jury was shown graphic images of Gabriel's injuries, forcing them to confront the true scale of the violence he endured. The courtroom grew heavy with silence as each photograph appeared. Bruises, burns, BB gun welts, fractured ribs. The doctor who treated Gabriel testified that it was the worst case of child abuse he had ever seen. At one point, even members of the jury wept openly. The emotional toll of the case was immense. Many questioned how two adults could possess such cruelty, and how so many professionals, teachers, social workers, law enforcement, could fail to intervene in time. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to portray Aguirre as a man manipulated by Pearl. They claimed he was slow and easily influenced, suggesting that Pearl orchestrated much of the abuse. But this narrative fell apart as evidence showed that Aguirre was the one who delivered the most severe beatings, the one who inflicted the final fatal blow. Witnesses recalled his sadistic behavior, his chilling calm when describing the violence, and his complete lack of remorse. Pearl's defense was equally unconvincing. Her attorneys argued she was a victim of domestic abuse, too afraid to protect her son. But prosecutors dismantled that claim with messages showing her cooperation and participation in the torture. In one text, she mocked Gabriel's suffering. In another, she lied to social workers, saying everything was fine. The jury saw through her attempts to shift blame. Gabriel's siblings, Ezekiel and Virginia, testified under protection, their words quiet but devastating. They described how Aguirre would force them to watch as he beat Gabriel, warning them they'd be next if they spoke up. They remembered the nights their little brother was locked in a cabinet, crying in the dark. Ezekiel recalled one moment when Gabriel whispered that he loved him before being dragged away again. Their testimony broke hearts across the nation and erased any remaining doubt about what had happened inside that apartment. When closing arguments began, the prosecution urged the jury to look beyond the defendant's excuses and see the truth of what had been done. Gabriel Fernandez was 8 years old, Hadami said. He was bound, gagged, starved, beaten, and burned. He died asking for help that never came. His words echoed through the courtroom, a haunting reminder of the system's failure and the innocence that was lost. After deliberating, the jury returned with a verdict. Isoro Aguirre was found guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. The courtroom erupted in emotion, some crying, others sighing in relief. For the first time, justice seemed within reach. During the sentencing phase, the same jurors were asked to decide whether Aguirre should face life in prison or the death penalty. Prosecutors argued that his acts were so cruel, so deliberate, that death was the only fitting punishment. The jury agreed. Aguirre was sentenced to death, showing no emotion as the decision was read. Pearl Fernandez, who pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding to avoid a possible death sentence, received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, she expressed no remorse, only the cold detachment that had defined her role in Gabriel's life and death. But even as the convictions brought a sense of closure, the outrage over the systemic failures continued to grow. The public demanded accountability from the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. How had multiple reports, direct warnings, and visible signs of abuse been ignored? Investigations revealed disturbing details about bureaucratic negligence. Social workers had visited the home several times but failed to document clear evidence of danger. In some cases, they falsified reports to indicate that Gabriel was safe. For social workers, Patricia Clement, Gregory Merritt, Kevin Bom, and Stephanie Rodriguez were charged with child abuse and falsifying records. It was a rare move in American legal history, an attempt to hold public servants criminally responsible for their inaction. Though the charges against them were later dismissed on appeal, the case left a lasting mark on child welfare reform. Officials vowed to improve training, communication, and accountability within the system. Committees were formed, policies rewritten, and new safeguards promised. But for many, the damage was irreversible. Gabriel's death had become a symbol of every child the system failed to protect. His story forced an uncomfortable truth into the open, that love, protection, and compassion can't always be guaranteed by the institutions meant to provide them. In 2020, Netflix released The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, a documentary that revisited every detail of the case. It reignited public grief and anger, bringing Gabriel's story to a global audience. Viewers wept as they heard his teacher's voice tremble while describing her desperate calls for help, as detectives recounted the horrific evidence they uncovered, and as prosecutors revealed their emotional struggles in pursuing justice. The documentary did more than recount a crime. It became a moral reckoning. People from around the world reached out to advocacy groups, demanding stronger child protection laws. The name Gabriel Fernandez became synonymous with the demand for change. In the years since, his legacy has lived on through reform efforts and advocacy. Teachers, social workers, and law enforcement officers cite his case as a constant reminder of what can happen when warnings are ignored. Community groups in Los Angeles created programs in his honor, aimed at ensuring no child falls through the cracks again. Yet, even as reforms took shape, the question lingered. Could it happen again? Many believe that without ongoing vigilance, the same failures could repeat themselves. For every Gabriel Fernandez whose story becomes known, there may be others still suffering in silence. Today, the apartment in Palmdale stands as a quiet monument to a tragedy that should never have happened. The neighbors who once heard the cries have long moved away, and the world has moved forward, but Gabriel's story remains etched into the conscience of all who learned it. His small dream of becoming a police officer, someone who could protect others, never came true in life, but in death, he became a guardian of a different kind. His suffering forced a nation to look inward, to question its institutions, and to confront the cruelty hidden in plain sight. In the end, Gabriel's story is not just about evil. It is about responsibility, compassion, and the price of indifference. It is about a teacher who refused to stay silent, investigators who refused to give up, and a society that finally opened its eyes. Gabriel's name continues to echo in courtrooms, classrooms, and policy meetings as a symbol of the innocent lives we must protect. The little boy who wanted to wear a police badge never got the chance to grow up, but his story changed laws, saved lives, and exposed a truth that will never be forgotten. The case of Gabriel Fernandez remains one of the most haunting reminders of how easily innocence can be destroyed when cruelty goes unchecked and when systems fail to act. But it also stands as a call to action, a promise that his death will not be in vain. Through every reform, every teacher's report, every child saved from harm, his spirit endures. Gabriel's story is one that must continue to be told, not only as a warning of what was lost, but as a reminder of what still must be protected.